In this lesson, we'll work on making some improvements to the overall lighting of our scene. So if you'd like to continue following along from this point, you can open up this 06 begin and pick up right where I'm at this point. So looking at the scene, now that we have all of our materials applied, we can start to see maybe a couple of problems here. The first thing that I notice is that this scene starts to look maybe a little bit darker than what I might want. So fortunately, this is a fairly easy problem to fix. All we need to do is go into our exposure control and maybe start to play with some of our exposure settings. So let's start by going into rendering, down to exposure control. And right now we have our exposure value set to 14. Again, if we were to come in here and render out a little preview thumbnail, we can come in here and start to adjust this a little bit more interactively and get at least some idea of what we're going to get for our render. It looks like in this case an exposure value of 13 is a little bit closer, so let me re-render this. Okay, so that definitely brightens things up a little bit. Now, looking at the coloration of this, it still seems a little bit fake, almost a little bit too perfect. So one of the things I'm going to do is try to drop in some kind of a background image, so that way we can actually start to get some clouds and things like that in this render. So to do that, once again, in my environment and effects, we're going to use this Mental Ray Physical Sky, which was created for us automatically whenever we built our daylight system in an earlier lesson. So to access what I need, I'm going to start by opening up the material editor. Let's take this environment map. Just simply click and drag this into my view. There we are. Now with this node selected, let's double click and tell this to use a custom background map. So now we just need to plug in the map that we want to use. So we'll plug in a standard bitmap. Okay, and inside your scene assets, images directory, let's scroll down, and we're going to look for this sky clouds. Go ahead and open that up. And now, whenever we re-render this, we should be able to see this cloud image showing up in our background. Now, this image that I'm using for this JPEG is actually pretty well exposed, so it's really designed to look pretty good on its own, but if you compare the overall brightness or the luminance of this sky to the rest of our scene, it seems a little bit off, because you would think that from a camera's point of view, if we were actually taking this through a photographic camera, if our regular scene was at this level of exposure, the sky would probably be a little bit more overexposed than what we see here. So just for the sake of realism, just as a quick and easy way, what I could do is go back to my map here. Let's go back to my bitmap. Now, at the moment, this is using gamma correction, so the image that gets rendered out looks just like it does as its original version, or its original image. Now, if I want, what I could do is set the override to 1, so that way this gamma correction doesn't necessarily kick in on the rendered image. So even though this image, by default, in its own natural state looks like this, whenever it gets rendered out, it'll look a little bit more exposed. Artistically, though, that's a little bit more the look that I'm going for, so even though this may not be technically the correct move to make, artistically, this is going to give me a little bit more the look that I want. So, let's re-render that. There we are, and now my sky is a little bit more overexposed, and visually this starts to look a little bit closer to what we would expect to see if we were looking at a photograph taken through a camera. Okay, now a few other artistic little changes that I might want to make to this. Looking at this, it looks like my scene is overall maybe not quite as warm as what I might like. So with this being kind of a early to mid-afternoon, we'd probably expect a little bit more of a yellow coloration to this. So what I could do is make a few adjustments to my sky. So let me come in and grab my daylight over here. Let's go to our modifiers. And in some of these lower rollouts, we have a few controls in here. So the first that we have is this haze. So normally, in real life, a sky has usually at least some level of haze. Now this haze is what's responsible for some of the scattering of light. So as we start to get more haze, the light comes in, starts to diffuse and scatter, and with these different wavelengths scattering at different frequencies, we start to get a slightly different color of overall illumination. With the haze set to 0, that's actually very, very rare in real life that you're actually going to see that. So as a result, some of the default lighting that we get here just looks a little bit too clean, a little bit too fake. So usually I like to add at least a little bit of haze in here. Let me start with something like 2. And if we were to render out maybe just half of this image for comparison, we can see if we're on the right track. Okay, and once that finishes up, you can see that there is definitely a little bit of a difference here. It's a little bit difficult to spot, but if you take a look in areas like this step here, you can see that because of this haze, it's actually scattering the light a little bit more, and so in some of these shadowed areas, we start to get now just a little bit more even, kind of natural spread of light. Now, in this case, these shadows may be a little bit less pronounced than what we might want, but that's pretty easy to fix. We can fix some of that with some of our exposure controls a little bit later. Another thing that we can do if we want to start to warm up some of the coloration in this scene a little bit more compared to what we have now and what we had before, we could even start to get in here and do a little bit of a red-blue shift. So if we were to take this maybe up a little bit to something like 0.1, in this case, a little bit can go a long way, so by tilting this up a little bit to some positive values, we can start to shift this a little bit more toward the red side and start to warm up our illumination. So once again, if I were to maybe draw out a region over here and re-render that for comparison, now we can definitely start to see a little bit of a change here. So whereas before we had sort of this cold illumination over here, now we start to warm things up a little bit more. And again, it's a fairly subtle change, and it's a bit more of an artistic change on my part. But again, just kind of helps things look a little bit closer to what I might expect for this type of a scene. Okay, so looking over at these areas of the steps, as I mentioned just a moment ago, we do have some shadows over here that maybe are a little bit softer and a little bit more kind of light than what we might want. So what we could attempt to do is jump into some of our exposure controls and start to maybe increase the strength of our shadows down here toward the bottom. So if we were to, again, create our little render preview, see what that looks like up here. If we wanted to, we could start to increase some of the strength of our shadows. So starting to dial that up a little bit more. So if we were to come in here and let's just re-render this view. And you can see that does make some of our shadows here a little bit deeper, but still probably leaves a little bit of work left to be desired. Now, this really kind of leads into a good point that I want to bring up, which is that you really shouldn't be concerned with getting absolutely perfect lighting results directly within 3ds Max. A lot of times that's just not going to be feasible. You'll spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of frustration getting everything to look just perfect. Instead, what I like to do is get my lighting to about 80 to 90% of my satisfaction. So as long as the light direction is coming from where I want, overall scene is illuminated fairly close to what I want, then a lot of times I can make those last 20 to 10% of my adjustments in another application, in a post application. After Effects, Toxic, Nuke, even Photoshop. And you can make those, again, last little bit of changes much, much faster and much more efficiently than what we could do here. So we could always come in and use something like Photoshop to change the exposure in some of these areas, brighten areas up, darken areas up. So again, as long as everything is relatively close, then you can do the rest of the work much, much faster elsewhere. So before we actually get to that point, though, there are a few areas that we still need to address. So as we start to get into some of these areas, like underneath the chair, and even some of these areas along the steps, you can see that we really don't have very good contact shadows or very good soft shadows in these areas. So we'll learn how we can start to address and resolve these issues in our next lesson.